What's up, everybody? It's great to see some new subs. First time in a long time. So they actually let a video get out. So welcome. I've started a new playlist, Static History. This will be video 2 in it. Eventually, I'll have a straightforward history that you should have learned in school. They may not all be back to back. I may throw something else in there, but we'll get it there. So, in part 1, I showed how in the 1300s, Europe was absolutely devastated. 2 out of 3 people in some places, and in others, 15 out of 16 were no more. They hide this in plain sight by saying that this was the Black D. This wasn't just a Yersinia pestis outbreak. There were a series of natural disasters that happened as the Earth went into one of its angry cycles. In part 3, I'll go into a lot more detail showing how this was indeed a worldwide event. But a quick example, around 1333 in China, a drought followed by massive torrents of rain, such that 400,000 people were washed away. Finally, the mountain Qinshu fell in and vast clefts were formed in the earth. In the succeeding year, more floods and droughts, and you'll see the pattern with that, and then a plague that took out 5 million. Then we go over and look at Europe, 1342. Great floods occurred in the vicinity of the Rhine and in France, which could not be attributed to rain alone. For everywhere, even on tops of mountains, springs were seen to burst forth and dry tracks were laid under water in an inexplicable manner. In the following year, the mountain Hongjiang in China fell in and caused a destructive deluge. So that's 2 mountain collapses and a tsunami for China. On the island of Cyprus, the affliction had already broke out when an earthquake shook the foundations of the island and was accompanied by so frightful a hurricane that the inhabitants offed their slaves so there wouldn't be an uprising against them. And now a Mediterranean tsunami. The sea overflowed, the ships were dashed to pieces on the rocks, and few outlived the terrific event whereby this fertile and blooming island was converted to a desert. Before the quake, a pestiferous wind spread so poisonous an odor that many, being overpowered by it, fell down suddenly and expired in dreadful agonies. Now, I can go on with that longer than anybody cares to listen to, trust me. It gets redundant after the first couple hours. But the important thing here is 700 years ago, if they were lucky, a third part of men were still alive, while in others, it took 15 out of 16 and utterly extirpated the human race. So by the end of the 1300s, supply lines were broke down, kingdoms in abject ruin. Whole sections of cities were completely devoid of people. There were many accounts that you did not travel alone because other people would grab you and have you for dinner, not as a guest. Now, here's the craziest thing about all this is, according to the official timeline, this didn't just happen once, it happened twice. Historians have simplified things and just say that this was the 536 AD event. There were all the same droughts, floods, quakes, and famine, and the sun could barely be seen, like it was a blue, hazy sun for about 18 months. Then you had the Justinian plague upon the land, where up to 2/3 of the population didn't make it through, with estimates up to 200 million. I read at the beginning how about 2/3 didn't make it in the 1300s, and once again, an estimate of up to 200 million. Now, you look at this on a timeline, and things start looking fishy. You have the 536 event, 200 million, 1300s, 200 million, and in between the two is the Dark Ages, where you don't have any advancement in technology, philosophy, historians, architecture. The European world just goes dark for 800 years. Basically, all you have is a list of pulpas and Byzantine emperors that never did anything of interest. There's no good stories from this time period. I mean, 1,000 years, come on. And the term Byzantine was coined in 1557 because they just considered themselves Roman for the time that they were in Constantinople, which is probably a couple hundred years. But Byzantine means secretive, hard to understand for a reason. And there's a lot of clues out there that this timeline didn't exist a few hundred years ago. This was published in 1749, and it's a compilation of accounts of everywhere getting wiped out all around the Mediterranean. Now, I don't know if he assigned the dates to this or if that had already been done by somebody else, But this is talking about the 1300s event, and they had no problem with describing the spread of the plague in this way. Down towards the bottom, it spread from people to people and from country to country. In the Low Countries, Brabant escaped. In 1350, it reached the Hungarians, Goths, Vandals, and the most northerly people. Now, the first big problem is the Goths disappeared around 711 AD, 600 years before that writing in 1350. The Vandals disappeared right at, hey, look at that, the 536 AD event. So he's saying that it spread to the people from 800 years ago up north. That'd be like me explaining the Spanish as Castilian or Mexicans as Toltecs. It's not a slip that you're casually going to make. But he clearly says that they're the men up to the north, which is what things would have looked like in the Roman era. But according to official history, the Goths came down and took over all of Europe, North Africa, and ruled all these areas for hundreds of years. Now, if this had been the case, then the author wouldn't think of them as the northern tribes because they came south and took over for a couple hundred years. So if this had happened, that author would have never just referred to them as the people of the north because they ruled everything for a couple hundred years. Then the world fell into the Dark Ages. So it's just a theory, of course, but could these events have been the same event? In part 3, I'll show you the remarkable similarities between each event, and what it seems like is they just took everything of the Eastern Empire and said 536 AD, everything of the Western Empire said 1300s. And if that's the case, then that would put the fall of the Roman era at 700-800 years ago. So Rome fell back around 500 AD, and it sat empty like this until the 1600s when these painters are out here painting this. Statues and priceless works of art just sat out in the weather for 1,000 years. And there's a lot of things about Rome and the rest of the world that don't really add up if you think about it. You guys know how part of the Colosseum has collapsed. Well, that happened in an earthquake in 1349. So this just sat here empty for 800 years and then finally fell down in an earthquake in the 1300s. The Santa Maria del Fiore, or the Florence Cathedral, was begun before the big event, but they lost their entire workforce apparently. And for 50 years, nobody had a clue of how to put a dome on top of this structure. Finally, Filippo Brunelleschi studied the Pantheon for a while and came up with a plan. But there's no way you can tell me that they started this huge construction project and they didn't have a clue of how they were going to finish it. Yeah, right. And this was at the end of 800 years of the Dark Ages where they basically didn't build anything and they went for this. So they just went from residential homes to the world's largest stone dome. No, I think this was begun at the end of an era of great architecture that brought us things like the Pantheon. They tell us that the Roman world collapsed and basically nothing was going on for hundreds of years. Then they go from nothing of significance to the most amazing cathedrals the world has ever seen. I would argue that this is just the natural progression of architectural and engineering advancements from the Roman world. You don't just start out and carve the statue of David. You work your way up to that. Emmett Scott argues the exact same thing in his book, A Guide to the Phantom Dark Ages, where he writes, "It was recognized that the medieval cathedrals represented an advance on Roman architecture, and it was conceded that the Romans would have been incapable of building such structures. Indeed, in many areas of technology, the Middle Ages were more advanced and sophisticated than classical Rome." They didn't just go from thatched roof houses to cathedrals. And we have a whole slew of technological advances that came on the scene at this time. These include the windmill, paper, plow collar, the stirrup, horseshoes, new musical instruments such as the violin and bagpipe, Arabic numerals, algebra, distillation of alcohol, double and triple sailing mast. And these were followed in the 12th to 15th century by mechanical clocks, the printing press, magnifying lenses, a whole gamut of architectural innovations, as well as such epoch-making innovations as gunpowder and firearms. Just so you know, cannons were a regular part of siege warfare in the 1300s. So we had hundreds of years of no technological innovation and then this explosion of technology. No, this was just a continuation of the ancient Roman world. Only the majority of people just became subsistence farmers because all the supply lines were broken and they had to start over from scratch, basically. Only the well-to-do families that had peasants to work the land had time to tinker with things like mechanical clocks and printing presses. Now, look, I know, depending on where you're coming from with this, that what I'm presenting overlaps with some other popular subjects on here, but unfortunately, I saw sensationalism take over those subjects. Clickbait is a hell of a drug. I was there when those subjects got started 6 years ago. I got shadowed, but really with this channel, I'm just starting over where the research world was about 6 years ago. And one of the main sources for the 1,000 years being added to the calendar was Anatoly Fomenko. Just like with everybody, I don't agree with everything he says, but if something's right, then it's right. And unfortunately, his diligent research got pushed aside by people looking at photographs. But this is important to understand. The chronology of ancient and medieval history in its present form had been created and, for the most part, concluded in a series of fundamental works of the 16th and 17th century that begins with the writings of Joseph Justus Scaliger, called the founder of modern chronology as a science. He was joined in this endeavor by Dionysius Petavius, a French Jesuit scholar. The Jesuits would eventually control all of the universities of Europe. The ground-laying work of Scaliger and Petavius of the 16th and 17th century present the ancient chronology as a table of dates given without any reasons whatsoever. It is declared to have been based on ecclesiastical tradition. So just like the 1749 book I showed, they just started slapping dates on things and saying that's how it is. But even this is after the Protestant Reformation had begun. But prior to that, 13 to 1500, the papacy basically had ultimate authority over everything. Look, I know all about the square and compass guys. I know all about the money changers, like the Red Shield financial empire, but they were still in the process of getting kicked out of over 100 countries at this time. And when we get to that point in history, we'll talk about them, but we're talking about back in the 1300s, the very beginning of our modern world. Everybody's heard about the Renaissance and the Inquisition, and between the two of those, the Church of Rome was basically able to write whatever history they wanted people to hear. It was actually Inquisitions, but I'm trying to keep things simple here. This is a Renaissance painting called The Donation of Constantine. There are all kinds of Easter eggs in these Renaissance paintings. Up at the top, you can barely make it out, but it says 1585, and this is depicting an event from around 300 AD, the time of Constantine. Up on the right, you can see the cherubim literally pulling the curtain back on this scene. Then below them, you have this guy full-on 1580s high fashion looking in on this scene from 300 AD. The banner across the top repeats this 3 times. It's the sun shooting a solar flare at the earth, and you see it actually hitting the earth. You'd almost think the artist is trying to tell us something by that, but the focal point of this is Constantine down on bended knee in front of the Holy Father, saying, "Please, holy man, take all of the power vested in me as the Roman emperor and rule over the lost sheep of our flock." That's why this is known as the Donation of Constantine. It's Constantine giving all the power of the Roman Empire over to the Church of Rome. It wasn't just a painting. There was also a document named Donation of Constantine that ceded all power to the Popa. This, as well as a lot of papal bulls, legitimized the idea of papal supremacy. The idea the church should not only be a religious authority, but secular as well. Now, of course, no kings recognized this as true, but they convinced a lot of people that they are the rightful secular authorities. And then in 1440, an Italian humanist did a philological analysis of the text and deemed it to be a forgery. So they had been touting the idea that they were the rightful heirs of the Roman Empire for at least 100 years, which we'll get to in a second, and they had made the whole thing up. And I think the artist here knew that this was a modern forgery, saying, no, I watched this happen sitting here in my medieval garb. That's just some speculation, but what's not speculation is they had a lock on information up until the Protestant Reformation. I can go into a lot more detail in the future. I'm trying to give you guys the 30,000 foot flyover, but it's important to understand who controlled the information at that time. Just look at today. Who in history was the eternal ray of light among this dark world? Rome, the Roman Empire. It's because they wrote history. By the 16 and 1700s, the Jesuits ran universities in every major city in Europe. And that's hundreds of years after the Inquisition, where if you got caught with the wrong book, you might be burned at the stake. It was a bad time to be a heretic with anything like a history book. So look, this is obviously a really big subject. There's as much to be unlearned as there is to be learned. I'm just giving you guys the 30,000 foot flyover here, but I've got mounds of evidence that backs all of this up. There's only so much we're going to get to in a little 15-minute video. So if you enjoyed it, I hope you'll subscribe, stick around, hit like, give a comment for the algo, and I will explain much more in future videos. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Static out.